People love to tell you that the worst year of your life will one day make sense, that you'll look back and see the shape of the gift hidden inside the wreckage. I never believed that particular piece of comfort. Not really. Not while I was living through it, kneeling on my own front porch with my hands full of broken terracotta and the wet, humiliating certainty that I had somehow failed at the one thing my marriage had quietly decided mattered most. I believe it now. It took a broken greenhouse pane, a quiet man 3 doors down who didn't know how to offer anything except practical, unglamorous help, and roughly 2 years of learning the difference between a man who counted everything and a man who counted nothing except how many times a day he could make me laugh. But I believe it now, completely, and this is the whole of how I got there. Washington Park, Denver. The first time I really looked at Caleb Reyes, my hands were bleeding a little, and there was glass all over the flagstone path behind my house. The greenhouse pane had cracked in the cold snap the night before, and when I'd gone out that morning to check on my orchids, the whole panel had finally given way, showering glittering shards across the vandapots and my bare forearms. I was on my knees picking up pieces with my fingers, too tired and too proud to go get gloves, when a voice said from the other side of the fence, "You're going to cut yourself worse doing it like that." I looked up. Caleb stood at the gap in the hedge that separated our yards, a mug of coffee steaming in one hand, his other hand resting on the collar of Duke, his enormous gray-muzzled German shepherd. He wore what he always wore, a faded olive fleece and canvas work pants, and he had that stillness about him, the kind that made you feel like you were the only moving thing in the world, and he was simply waiting to see what you'd do next. My neighbor, 3 doors down, the quiet one, the one Grant called the handyman, like it was an insult. "I'm fine," I said, which was a lie I told so often it barely registered as one anymore. He didn't argue. He just set his coffee down on the fence post, ducked through the gap, and crouched beside me. And without asking permission, he started gathering the bigger shards into a folded piece of cardboard he produced from somewhere, like he carried spare cardboard for exactly this purpose, which, I would learn, he did. "You've got a stress crack along the frame," he said. "Aluminum expands, glass doesn't. Every winter it's going to do this until you reframe it properly." I laughed, and it came out wet and a little unhinged. "Add it to the list," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, the way he had a habit of doing, assessing, unhurried, no pity in it at all. "What list?" he said. "Nothing," I said, "just a joke." He didn't push. He never pushed. He finished clearing the glass, then stood and held out his hand to pull me up, and his palm was rough and warm and entirely impersonal. And for one strange second, I wanted to hold on to it a beat longer than I should have. "I've got a spare pane in my garage," he said. "Tempered. It'll hold up better. I'll bring it by this afternoon." "Caleb, you don't have to do that," I said, already knowing it wouldn't matter what I said. "It's taking up space," he said, which was what he always said, as if every kindness he offered was really just him doing me a favor by getting rid of clutter. He turned to go, then paused. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding at my forearm. "Small cut, should still wash it." Then he whistled once for Duke and walked back through the gap in the hedge, and I stood there in my ruined garden with a scraped arm and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in my chest, like I had breathed real air for the first time in weeks. 20 minutes later, I was inside, running my arm under the kitchen tap when I heard Grant's Range Rover pull into the driveway. He came in already talking, phone against his ear, tie loosened, the particular energy he had when a deal was going his way, sharp and electric and entirely elsewhere. He clocked the bandage on my arm without really seeing it. "What happened here?" he said, covering the phone with his palm. "Greenhouse pane came down. Caleb from next door helped me clean it up." Something flickered behind his eyes, brief and cold. "Caleb, the war reenactor," he said. "What was he doing on our property?" "Helping, Grant. He was being kind." Grant made a small sound in his throat, not quite a laugh. "Sweetheart," he said, "I have a landscaping crew on retainer for exactly this reason. You don't need to be out there fraternizing with the guy who still wears his fatigues to Home Depot. It sends a signal." "What signal?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. "That we need help," Grant said, simply, like it was self-evident. "That we're the kind of people who need our neighbors." "We're not, Nora. We pay people for that." Then he was back on the phone, already halfway down the hall to his office, and I stood there, with my bandaged arm in the strange, lingering warmth from Caleb's hand, and thought, not for the first time, that I had married a man who had never once in 3 years asked me what I needed, only ever informed me of what I should want. That night, after the salmon Grant liked and the wine he approved of, and the silence that had become the third occupant of our marriage, I lay in bed and did what I did every night. I picked up the little laminated card from my nightstand drawer, the one with the grid of boxes, and I marked the temperature from the thermometer beside it. 98.2. I connected the dot to yesterday's with a thin blue line, and the line, as it had for 28 months, sat flat and unremarkable and cruel in its ordinariness. No spike, no signal, nothing. I knew the whole liturgy of it by then. The cold gel of the ultrasound wand, the particular gentle, sorry voice Dr. Whitcomb used when she said the words, "diminished ovarian reserve." The way she'd looked at my chart at my last appointment and said, "At 36, with your numbers, I want us to have an honest conversation about IVF, and possibly down the road, donor eggs." I hadn't told Grant the specifics. I'd told him we needed to escalate, which was a phrase he understood, escalation, a word from his own vocabulary. And he'd written the check for the first round of IVF without blinking, the way he wrote checks for everything, as a transaction that would surely, eventually, yield the expected return. It hadn't. The first round failed at the transfer. The second round produced 2 viable embryos, and I had let myself hope in a way I now understood to be a kind of self-harm. And that transfer failed too. And the 2 lines on the pregnancy test stayed stubbornly, devastatingly, 1 line. And the silence that moved into our house after that second negative test never really moved back out. Grant didn't yell. That was never his register. He simply receded, the way a tide goes out, so slowly you don't notice until you're standing on wet sand, looking at a horizon that used to be full of water. He started working later. He started traveling more. Singapore, then Austin, then Singapore again. He stopped asking about the little laminated card. I filled the silence the way I always filled things, uselessly, industriously. I got my real estate license, which I never used. I took an online certification in project management, which I never used either. I organized the block's holiday potluck. I baked, I cataloged, somewhere in the back of my mind, every credential and casserole dish as proof that I was still a productive, functioning woman, and not simply a set of ovaries that had failed to deliver on the terms of an agreement I hadn't fully understood I'd signed. I saw Caleb often, in the incidental way you see a person who lives 3 doors down and keeps the same early hours you do. I'd bring him lemon bars, the ones I'd learned to make from my grandmother, and he'd fix the cabinet hinge that had been sticking since we moved in, or replace the greenhouse pane, or shovel the walk before I was even awake to see the snow had fallen. He collected my packages when I was out. I collected his when he traveled for what he vaguely called consulting work. Once he found me crying over a scorched tray of shortbread, a stupid, trivial trigger for an entire ocean of grief. And he didn't ask a single question. He just made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and sat with me at the kitchen island until my breathing evened out. "He's a good man," I said to Grant once, after Caleb had spent an entire Saturday repairing the section of fence a windstorm had knocked flat, refusing every offer of payment. "Who?" Grant said, not looking up from the contract he was redlining. "Caleb. He fixed the fence. Wouldn't take a dime for it." Grant made that sound again, the almost laugh. "Probably needs the goodwill more than the money," he said. "Guy's been living alone in that house since God knows when, driving a truck older than our marriage. It's charity work for him, having neighbors like us to fix things for." "Don't encourage it, Nora. It's unseemly." I didn't argue. Arguing with Grant was like shouting into wind off the Rockies. It just came back at you colder and left you gasping. Our third anniversary fell on a wet, gray Tuesday in October. I made a reservation at Beacon, the restaurant where we'd celebrated our engagement, the one with the view of the Front Range and the tasting menu Grant loved to describe to other people. I wore the burgundy dress he'd once told me was the only color he liked me in. I lit 2 candles at home before we left, just for myself, a small private ritual. Grant texted at 7:10. "Running behind," he wrote. "Start without me." I ordered a glass of the Sancerre he always ordered for me, and it tasted like nothing, like drinking cold water with a headache. He arrived at 8:40, his energy electric in that particular way it got when a deal had closed in his favor, smelling of expensive scotch and cold night air. "Sorry, darling," he said, kissing my cheek before he'd even sat down. "Close the Meridian account." Huge multiple. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it, because his wins had always felt like they belonged to both of us. Some fiction I'd maintained long after the evidence stopped supporting it. Through dinner, he talked about the deal, about a VP he was poaching from a rival firm, about a Series C round on the horizon. I asked the right questions in the right places. Our anniversary sat between us at the table like an uninvited third guest neither of us would name. Over dessert, a slice of chocolate torte I picked at without appetite, he finally went still. He looked at me, actually looked at me, for the first time in what felt like months, and the look in his eyes was the one I'd seen him turn on underperforming portfolio companies. Clinical. Already decided. "Nora," he said, "we need to talk." My stomach dropped somewhere south of the floor. "All right," I said. "This isn't working," he said, calm as if he were commenting on the wine list. "Us. This." He couldn't even say the word baby. He couldn't say family. "We knew this would be hard," I said, the words tumbling out desperate and rehearsed. I'd practiced this exact defense in the shower 100 times without ever believing I'd need it. "Dr. Whitcomb said there are other protocols. We could look at a gestational carrier." He held up one hand, the universal gesture he used to end negotiations. "I've run the numbers," he said. "Financially, emotionally, in terms of time horizon, the return isn't there anymore. Your doctor said your odds are under 20% now, didn't she?" He said it like a man laying down a winning hand. "I need an heir, Nora. A clear line of succession. It's not just personal, it's strategic. This endless hoping, these procedures, it's degrading for both of us." I felt the restaurant tilt around me. Degrading, I repeated, the word barely a whisper. Yes, he said, chasing a statistical improbability. I built a company by knowing when to cut a loss and pivot. This is a loss we need to cut. I'm the loss, I said. The situation is, he corrected, as if that distinction changed anything at all. I've had Aldridge draw up papers. It's clean. The settlement is generous given the circumstances. The prenup. The one I'd signed at 29, dizzy with love, trusting a man who'd promised me a life. My own lawyer, a friend of my mother's, had insisted on one clause, that after 3 years of marriage, in the event of a no-fault divorce, I would receive a percentage of the growth in marital assets rather than a flat sum. Grant had agreed to it without argument, calling it a bonus structure for a successful partnership, the kind of phrase he used about everything, marriage included. The prenup says I get 18% of shared asset growth after 3 years, I said, my voice finding a thread of steel I didn't know it still had. That's the agreement, Grant. He smiled then, thin and cold. A smile I recognized from the 2 times I'd watched him negotiate with a supplier he intended to crush. You really think that document is going to hold up to what I can spend on lawyers? He said. I will bury you in motions until you're renting a studio in Aurora and calling your mother in Ohio to ask for gas money. I can tie this up in court until you're 40. Is that what you want? The threat came out in the exact same register he'd used to order the wine. Calm, certain, administrative. This was the man who had once bragged, at a dinner party, about making a litigious former employee's life so unpleasant the man had moved out of state rather than continue the fight. He could do it. He would do it. You'd really do that to me? I said, and even as I said it, I knew how pathetic the question sounded, because I already had my answer. I'm protecting my interests, he said, the way I always have. He slid a manila envelope across the white tablecloth. The offer's fair. Take it, Nora. Walk away with some dignity. Don't make this ugly. Ugly, I said, and a laugh came out of me that had no humor in it at all. You're leaving me because my ovaries underperformed a business plan, and you're telling me not to make it ugly. Keep your voice down, he hissed, glancing at the neighboring table. This is a business conversation, nothing more. Sign the papers, be out within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I said. That's it. You should have seen this coming, he said, already signaling for the check. The house is in my name. The accounts are mine. The offer is more than fair given what you contributed. The drive home was silent, rain streaking sideways across the windshield like something trying to get in. Inside our glass and concrete house on Cherry Street, a house I had spent 2 years making beautiful and had never, I understood now, made mine. I went to the guest room and lay on top of the covers without turning down the bed. And I didn't sleep. The next 2 weeks passed in a fog of quiet devastation. I packed my clothes, my books, the handful of paintings I'd brought into the marriage. I left the furniture. I left the dishes we'd registered for. I left a shared life that had, I was beginning to understand, never actually been shared at all. Grant made himself scarce, staying at a hotel or perhaps already at the apartment of whichever 28-year-old associate he'd undoubtedly already lined up. The cruelty of it was so total it had stopped feeling personal. It felt like weather, like something you simply survived. The morning of the move, a gray U-Haul sat in the driveway like a hearse, and I was carrying a box of shoes down the front steps, my arms shaking, when a voice behind me said, "Need a hand?" I turned. Caleb stood at the base of the driveway in jeans and a plain gray Henley, hands loose at his sides, Duke sitting patiently beside him. This time, I didn't pretend I was fine. The tears I'd been holding back for 2 weeks simply broke, right there on the front steps, and I nodded because I couldn't speak. He didn't ask a single question. He just started loading boxes, working with a quiet, economical strength, handling my things with more visible care than Grant had ever handled anything of mine. He'd brought moving blankets. He'd brought ratchet straps. He knew exactly how to pack a truck, the kind of knowledge you don't pick up by accident. "Where to?" he asked, once the house had been emptied of everything that was mine. "An apartment in Athmar Park," I said. "It's temporary. It's what I can afford." He nodded. "I'll follow you," he said. And he did. His old Ford truck a steady presence in my rear-view mirror the entire drive across the city, through the rain, past the life I used to have. He helped me carry everything up 2 flights of stairs into a cramped 1-bedroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's disappointment. When the last box was inside, I stood in the empty, echoing space, shivering. "Caleb," I said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said. He looked at me steadily, the way he always did, seeing everything, the grief and the fear and the humiliation, without flinching from any of it. "You're going to be all right, Nora." "I don't feel all right," I said. "That's because you're in the middle of it," he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small terracotta pot with a single sprig of rosemary planted in it. "This one drains," he said, setting it on the bare kitchen counter, a tiny green thing in a beige void. Then he left with a single nod, and I sank down against the wall and cried until my ribs ached. And when the storm finally passed into a dull, numb quiet, I opened my banking app and stared at the settlement deposit, a number that felt enormous and pathetic in the same breath. More money than my mother had ever seen in one place, and a fraction of what I had helped Grant become. My name had already been removed from every joint account. My phone buzzed. My mother. "Hi, sweetie. Just thinking of you. How's the Denver weather?" I plastered a smile onto my face she couldn't see but would somehow hear anyway. "It's cold, Mom," I said. "How's the book club?" As I talked, telling her everything was fine, just fine, I stared at the little rosemary plant on the counter. Drainage, so the roots wouldn't rot, so the pot wouldn't finally split open the way mine had. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe I hadn't been the problem. Maybe I'd simply been kept in the wrong container for 3 years, with no way for anything to drain, until the whole thing cracked from the inside. I had $4,100 to my name that wasn't already earmarked for rent and dread, and one small, fragile plant that somebody had thought, unprompted, to give proper drainage. It didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an ending. But sitting there on the cold floor of my new, lonely apartment, a small, treacherous thought whispered itself into the silence. Endings are just containers finally breaking open. What grows out of the wreckage is nobody's decision but your own. Athmar Park, Denver. The apartment didn't get better with time. It just absorbed more of the gray winter light and amplified the sound of my own breathing at night. The settlement money became a ticking clock I checked obsessively. Rent and food and gas, and the sheer staggering cost of simply continuing to exist. I gave myself exactly 48 hours to fall apart completely. I ate cereal straight from the box, watched daytime television with the sound too loud, cried until my head throbbed and my eyes were swollen shut. On the third morning, I showered, put on the one blazer I still owned that didn't feel like a costume from someone else's life, and updated my LinkedIn profile. The headline stared back at me, mocking. Former executive spouse and household strategist seeking administrative opportunities. It sounded exactly as pathetic as it was. The job search was its own specific humiliation. 3 years as a homemaker chasing a pregnancy that never came was a black hole on a resume, and Grant's world of venture capital and closed-door investor dinners was permanently closed to me now. Not an asset, but a liability. The discarded first wife of a man on his way up. I finally landed a temporary administrative role at a small family-owned outdoor gear distributor near the rail yards. $18 an hour, no benefits. The owner, a gruff, kind man named Walt, looked at my overqualified resume and then at my hands, which were trembling slightly during the interview, and asked, not unkindly, "Divorce?" I nodded, unable to speak. "My daughter went through one," he said. "Took her the better part of a year before she stopped flinching at slammed doors. You start Monday." The work itself was a mercy in its mindlessness. Data entry, scheduling freight pickups, answering the phone with a chipper, "Alpine Trail Supply, how can I direct your call?" My hands, which had once organized charity galas and curated wine cellars, now fumbled with a decade-old phone system. My coworkers were kind in a careful, distant way. Word travels in certain Denver circles even faster than it travels anywhere else. And even the ones who tried to be discreet let it slip that they'd heard things. I was 3 weeks into the new job, standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store near my apartment, with a coupon in one hand, comparing the store brand oats against the name brand I could no longer justify, when a familiar voice behind me said, "How's the settling in going, Nora?" I turned. Caleb, in his usual olive fleece, a basket with an avocado and a loaf of bread in one hand. "Fine," I said, too brightly. He didn't flinch at the lie, just looked at my basket, then back at me. "You forgot the heavy cream," he said. "Makes lemon bar filling set better." I stared at him. "I haven't baked since," I said quietly. "I know," he said, and before I could react, he plucked the generic oats out of my hand and dropped a box of name-brand cereal into my cart instead. "Last longer," he said, and turned toward the dairy case, leaving me flushed and flustered in the aisle. At the register, my face still hot, I swiped my debit card and the little screen blinked back, insufficient funds. My heart seized. That wasn't possible. I'd checked my balance the night before. I swiped again. Same result. "Is there a problem?" the young cashier asked, her patience visibly thinning. "I must have miscalculated," I stammered, already reaching to put things back. "It's taken care of," said a calm voice beside me. Caleb had appeared with his own 2 items already bagged, and he handed the cashier a $100 bill before I could stop him. "No," I said, mortification burning through me. "I can't let you do that. You're holding up the line," he said, not unkindly, nodding at the woman waiting behind me, and he simply gathered both bags and walked toward the exit, leaving me no choice but to follow, sputtering apologies and promises to pay him back. He stopped beside his truck, parked next to my aging Corolla. "Grant froze the joint accounts," he said. "Your card was probably still linked to an old auto pay. It's a common tactic. Call the bank." The cold, practical assessment cut straight through my panic. And of course, this was Grant tidying up loose ends, erasing me line by line from a life he'd already decided was finished. I sagged against my car door. "God, I'm such an idiot," I said. "You're not an idiot," he said. "You're in a war you didn't know you were fighting." He opened my passenger door and set the groceries inside. "Go home," he said. "Call the bank. Eat something that isn't the free samples from the deli counter." He handed me his own bag, the one with the avocado. "Trade you," he said. "I like the oats better anyway." Then he got into his truck and drove off, and I stood there, holding a bag of groceries I hadn't paid for, my throat tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. 2 weeks later, my car died for good. A final shuddering gasp in the pouring rain on the 6th Avenue viaduct during rush hour, hazard lights blinking uselessly as horns bloomed angrily behind me. Tears mixed with rain on my face, the whole thing finally, absurdly funny in its cruelty. My phone sat at 4% battery. I scrolled past Grant's number, blocked months ago, past my mother's, unable to face telling her yet another thing had gone wrong, and landed on the only other Denver number I knew by heart. I'd saved it after the grocery store with a note. "Caleb, groceries, $63.40, still owe him." He picked up on the second ring. "Reyes." "Caleb, it's Nora. I'm so sorry to bother you. My car died on the viaduct and I don't know who else to call, and my roadside coverage lapsed," and the words spilled out in a wet, frantic rush. "Send your location," he said. "All business, no wasted words." I fumbled and shared it. "Lock the doors," he said. "Don't get out of the car. 15 minutes. He was there in 11. His truck's headlights cut through the gray downpour, pulling in behind me with a set of amber strobes on the roof, the kind of professional-grade lighting you don't buy at an auto parts store. He was out in the rain instantly, flashing something from his wallet at the traffic officer who'd just arrived, and within minutes, a tow truck was backing into position under his sharp, economical hand signals. He opened my passenger door. "Come on," he said. "I'll get you home." "My car," I said, teeth chattering. "Rosa's taking it," he said. "She's honest. She'll call with an estimate." He guided me into his truck, holding his own jacket over my head against the rain. The cab was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather and old coffee, not a single stray receipt anywhere. We drove in silence for several blocks before I managed, "Thank you. I seem to be making a habit of needing rescuing." "You're not being rescued," he said. "Your transportation failed. You called for a logistical solution, and I provided one." He glanced sideways at me. "You're freezing." He reached behind the seat and produced a gray fleece, worn soft with use. "Clean," he said. "Put it on." It swallowed my hands and smelled like cedar and something I couldn't name, and it was the warmest I'd felt in weeks. He didn't drive me straight home. He took me to a small garage tucked beneath the viaduct, a hand-painted sign reading "Rosa's Precision Auto" swinging in the wind. A woman in stained coveralls waved us into a bay, and Caleb had a brief, low conversation with her over the open hood before handing over a card of his own. When he got back in the truck, I was ready for him. "Caleb, no," I said. "Absolutely not. I'll take the bus. I'll figure something out." "Alternator and water pump are both gone," he said. "Starter's not far behind. Rose is giving you a fair price, $600, parts and labor. Throwing more money at that car is a bad investment, Nora." $600 was a mountain I couldn't climb. "I don't have $600, I said. "I do," he said. "I can't take your money." "You're not taking it," he said. "You're accepting a short-term, interest-free loan from a friend who doesn't want you catching pneumonia waiting for the 20 bus in January." His tone left no room to argue further. "Rosa will have it ready tomorrow by 5. I'll get you to work and back until then." "Caleb, why are you doing all this?" The question burst out of me, raw and a little desperate. "You don't owe me anything. I was just the neighbor who brought you lemon bars." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain-streaked street. "Because someone did it for me once," he finally said, his voice lower now. "After Sarah died," he said, "I wasn't in a good place. Guy from my old unit just showed up one day, fixed my roof without being asked, wouldn't take a dime. Said I'd have done the same for him." He looked over at me. "You would have. For anyone. I've watched you take in Mrs. Okafor's packages for a month straight when her hip was bad. You organized the whole block's holiday potluck when nobody else would lift a finger. You brought lemon bars to the guy at the end of the street everyone else called the weird loner, just because he fixed your greenhouse." He put the truck in gear. "Call it community service," he said. He drove me to my building, and as I moved to get out, he spoke again. "There's a diner on Alameda," he said. "The Copper Kettle. 6 tomorrow after we get your car, if you want to talk. Or not talk. No obligation either way." I looked at this quiet, serious, inexplicably steady man who seemed to see the whole wreckage of my life and offer not pity, but practical, string-free solutions, one at a time. And I realized I was so tired of being alone with all of it. "What time did you say?" I asked. 6, he said. "Okay," I said. The Copper Kettle was all cracked red vinyl and chrome trim, the air thick with coffee and grilled onions. Caleb was already in a corner booth when I arrived, 2 mugs steaming in front of him, and he'd ordered me a slice of apple pie without asking, which turned out to be exactly what I wanted, and had no idea how to say out loud. We made stilted small talk for the first few minutes. The car was running fine, work was work. The rain showed no sign of letting up. Then, I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the ordinary warmth of the diner, or the coffee, or the plain, unadorned kindness of the man across the table. But the whole story came pouring out of me. Not the cleaned-up version I gave my mother on the phone, but the real one. The fertility charts kept religiously for 2.5 years. The 2 failed IVF rounds. The particular clinical cruelty of Grant's voice at that restaurant table. The word degrading. The manila envelope. The threat about lawyers and studios in Aurora. Caleb listened without interrupting once. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell me everything happened for a reason, or that I was better off, or any of the small, useless comforts people reach for because silence makes them uncomfortable. He just listened, his eyes steady on mine. And when I finally ran out of words, he said, "That's not a marriage ending. That's an asset being divested." I flinched at the accuracy of it. He caught the flinch. "Sorry," he said. "Too clinical. Habit." "What kind of work did you say you did?" I asked, deflecting, because I wasn't ready yet to sit inside my own grief any longer that night. "Consulting," he said, in the same flat, closed-door way he always said it. And I let it go, because pushing at Caleb was like pushing at a locked door. You learned quickly it wouldn't open until he decided to open it. Over the following months, something shifted, slowly, the way ground shifts before you notice the crack in the foundation. I got my car back from Rosa's and paid Caleb back in installments he clearly didn't need, but accepted anyway, because he understood, I think, that letting me pay him back mattered more to my dignity than the money mattered to his bank account. I started leaving him lemon bars again, the recipe finally coming back to my hands the way muscle memory does. He started fixing things around my apartment that I never mentioned needing fixed. A sticking window latch, a dripping faucet, always somehow already done by the time I noticed the problem. Duke, his old shepherd, took to greeting me at the fence gap between our old houses whenever I walked back through the old neighborhood to visit Walt's shop, though I no longer lived there, tail thumping against the grass like I still belonged. Dottie Marsh, who had lived on Cherry Street longer than anyone and made it her personal mission to know everything about everyone, cornered me outside the church rummage sale one Saturday. "Nora Bennett," she said, hand pressed to her chest as if the sight of me were a physical shock. "I heard the whole terrible business. I just think it's criminal, what that man did to you, after everything you gave up for him." Then, without missing a beat, her eyes sharpened with curiosity. "And I hear you've been spending time with Caleb Reyes. Is that so?" "He's a good friend," I said carefully. Dottie made a small, knowing sound. "Well," she said, "he's certainly devoted. Every winter snows barely stopped falling, and that man's already got your old walk cleared. Well, your new one too now, I suppose." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. And Dottie, sensing there was no gossip to be extracted, moved on to the church's new roof fund with visible disappointment. It was around then that I started noticing things about Caleb I hadn't let myself notice before. The way his hands, scarred and calloused, moved with a precision that seemed almost surgical when he fixed something. The way he never once raised his voice, not at a stuck bolt, not at a bad driver who cut him off, not even, I would learn much later, under circumstances that would have justified rage in almost anyone else. The way Duke never left his side except to check on me, as if the dog understood something about the arrangement that I hadn't fully worked out myself yet. I started looking forward to seeing his truck in the driveway when I visited the old street. I started, God help me, thinking about him at odd moments, doing data entry at Alpine Trail Supply, folding laundry in my too quiet apartment. And each time I caught myself doing it, I felt a small guilty jolt, as if grief for my marriage entitled me to nothing but grief, as if wanting something new was a betrayal of the version of myself who'd cried on her kitchen floor 8 months earlier. I heard about Grant in fragments, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. He was engaged again to a 26-year-old named Bryn, who'd worked in his marketing department. The engagement announced in a Denver Business Journal piece about power couples in the city's tech scene. There was a photo of the two of them at a gala, Grant's hand at the small of her back in the same possessive way it had once rested at mine. Dottie, predictably, had opinions. "She's already expecting, apparently," Dottie confided at the next rummage sale, practically glowing with the scandal of it. 4 months along, if you can believe the timeline. I did the math without wanting to, and felt something in my chest that I expected to be grief, and instead, unsettlingly, was almost relief. It confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't let myself fully believe, that it truly had never been about me, about anything I had or hadn't done, that the entire architecture of my failure had been built for me by a man who'd already decided, long before that anniversary dinner, exactly which woman would be standing beside him in 5 years. And it wasn't going to be a woman past 35 with numbers Dr. Whitcomb didn't love. I threw myself into something that had been quietly forming in the back of my mind for months. During my 3 childless years with Grant, I had, in a strange, sideways way, become an accidental expert in a kind of design nobody talked about at dinner parties. Spaces built for people rebuilding their lives from nothing. I'd volunteered back before the divorce at a transitional shelter downtown, helping stage donated furniture into rooms that felt like homes instead of way stations. And something about that work had lodged itself in me differently than the real estate license or the project management certificate ever had. It felt, for the first time in years, like something I was doing instead of something I was proving. I started small, a logo I designed myself on a free trial of design software, a website built over 3 sleepless weekends. Bennett Transitional Design, I called it at first, before later shortening it, offering my services to shelters and nonprofits at rates barely above cost, learning trauma-informed design principles from library books checked out on my lunch break at Alpine Trail Supply. Sightlines and soft edges and controllable light. Spaces that gave people who'd had every ounce of control stripped from their lives some small measure of it back. Walt let me use the break room printer for flyers. Caleb, without being asked, built me a set of modular shelving units for my first paying client, a women's shelter in 5 Points, refusing payment with his usual flat, immovable, "it's just scrap wood from a job." The shelter director, a formidable woman named Renata, called me 2 weeks after I finished that first project. "The women keep telling me it's the first room that's felt like theirs," she said. "Do you have a card?" "I don't," I admitted. "I don't really have a business yet." "Get one," she said. "I'm telling everyone I know." By the following spring, Bennett Transitional Design had 6 clients, and I had given notice at Alpine Trail Supply, Walt shaking my hand at the door and telling me if it didn't work out, there'd always be a phone to answer here. Caleb had become, without either of us naming it out loud, the person I called first with good news. The small shelter contract, the larger grant-funded project with the city, and the person who showed up without being asked, the night a client contract fell through, and I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by fabric swatches, feeling like a fraud in a blazer. It was Duke, in the end, who forced the question neither of us had been brave enough to ask. Caleb had asked if I'd walk the dog with him one warm April evening, an ordinary request that had become, by then, a fairly ordinary occurrence, and we were most of the way around the reservoir when Duke, arthritic hips and all, suddenly bolted after a squirrel with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog, yanking the leash clean out of Caleb's hand. We both laughed, chasing him down together, and when we finally cornered him by a picnic table, breathless, Caleb reached for the leash at the same moment I did, and our hands closed over each other's instead, and neither of us moved to pull away. "I've been trying not to do this," he said quietly, looking at our hands rather than at me. "Do what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Want something I have no business wanting from a woman who's had one man already make her feel like a liability," he said. "I'm not interested in being anyone's rebound or anyone's rescue fantasy. I want you to want this because you actually want it, not because I showed up with a truck and a toolbox at the right moment." I looked at him, at his careful, guarded, entirely unnecessary caution, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for a year finally loosened. "Caleb," I said, "you didn't rescue me. You handed me tools and got out of my way while I rescued myself. That's not the same thing, and I think you know it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled. Not the faint, almost smile I'd catalogued a dozen times over the past year, but a real one, unguarded, that changed his whole face. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said back. And Duke, sensing something had shifted, sat down heavily on both our feet and refused to move, which struck us both as so absurd that we ended up laughing until neither of us could stand up straight. He told me about Sarah on our 4th real date, sitting on his back porch with Duke asleep between us. They'd met at Fort Carson, both of them logistics officers, married young and stupid and happy, he said, the way people are who don't yet know how much luck their happiness depends on. She'd died 6 years earlier, an aneurysm, sudden and senseless, no warning at all, gone between one ordinary Tuesday and the next. "I stopped being able to be around people for a long time after that," he told me. "Sold the house we'd bought together, bought the one on Cherry Street because it was quiet and nobody expected anything from me there. I fixed things because fixing things was the only language I had left that made any sense. A broken hinge has an answer. Grief doesn't. It took me a long time to let anyone close enough to notice I was still standing there behind all the fixing. I understand that better than I'd like to, I said, and told him about the years of charting temperatures and marking dots on a laminated card, connecting one flat line to the next, treating my own body like a problem that better data could eventually solve. We sat in the quiet afterward, not needing to fill it, and I understood that this specific, unhurried, uncalculated quiet was the thing I had been starving for the entire length of my marriage without ever having the words to name it. A year to the day after the greenhouse pane had shattered across my flagstone path, Caleb showed up at my apartment door, holding, absurdly, a small potted rosemary plant identical to the one he'd given me the night I moved out of the Cherry Street house. Except this one, he pointed out, had grown considerably, its woody stem thick enough now to suggest real permanence. I didn't know if you'd remember the date, I said, laughing, touched in a way that caught me off guard. I remember every date that matters, he said simply, which I'd come to understand over the previous year was not an exaggeration, but a plain statement of fact about how his mind worked. The same precise, load-bearing attentiveness that let him diagnose a failing alternator by sound now applied, apparently, to the calendar of my own life. We spent that particular evening exactly the way we'd spent so many others by then, easy and unhurried, a simple dinner at his kitchen island, no reservation required, no restaurant with a view of a mountain range neither of us needed to prove anything to anymore. I thought, at one point during that dinner, about my third wedding anniversary with Grant, the burgundy dress, the 2 lit candles nobody else had noticed, the manila envelope sliding across white linen, and I found, examining the memory the way you might examine an old scar, that it no longer produced the sharp, immediate flinch it once had. It had become simply a fact about a former version of my life, distant and instructive rather than raw. I told Caleb this, somewhat to my own surprise, laying the whole comparison out plainly, the 2 anniversaries, the 2 men, the 2 entirely different registers of attention. He listened, without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "I think about that a lot, actually." Not competing with him exactly, but making sure every ordinary Tuesday I get with you is worth more than every expensive dinner he ever bought you and then used as a stage to end things. I don't need a view of the mountains to prove anything. I just need you to know, every single day, plainly, without theatrics, that you're not a line item to me. You never will be, and I intend to keep proving that for as long as you'll let me. It was, I understood even as he said it, the exact moment I fully let myself stop bracing for an ending. I had spent a full year, if I was honest with myself, still half expecting some version of that restaurant table to reappear, some cold, clinical reversal I hadn't yet been shown the evidence for. Because 3 years with Grant had trained my nervous system to treat safety as a temporary condition rather than a stable one. Sitting at Caleb's kitchen island with a year-old rosemary plant between us, I felt that particular, well-worn brace finally, quietly release. And I understood that whatever came next, however long we had, it would not be built on the same shifting ground my first marriage had stood on. It would be built the way Caleb built everything, patiently, with drainage designed in from the start, strong enough to hold real weight without ever threatening to crack. Grant sent one email that October, forwarded through his lawyer, a curt note wondering if I'd be interested in a quiet settlement adjustment, given how well my little design venture appeared to be doing, according to friends in common circles, and offered to renegotiate downward what he'd already paid me, framed as a favor. I didn't respond. Caleb, when I told him about it over dinner, went very still in a way I hadn't seen before, a controlled, focused stillness that made me understand for the first time that there was a version of this man capable of things far outside the quiet, patient neighbor I'd come to know. "Do you want me to look into anything?" he asked. And there was something in the phrasing, "look into," rather than "talk to a lawyer about," that snagged at me, though I let it go at the time, distracted by my own anger at Grant's audacity. It was Renata, of all people, who first said out loud what I'd been too careful to say to myself. We were at the shelter, finalizing furniture placement for a new intake room, when she looked at me sideways and said, "You're glowing, you know that?" "It's this new contract," I said. "It's the way that man looks at you," she corrected, nodding toward the parking lot where Caleb was unloading a shelving unit from his truck bed. "I've buried one husband and divorced another, Nora. I know what it looks like when a woman's finally landed somewhere safe." I didn't argue with her. I didn't have the words to yet, but something in me had already agreed. I missed my period in early December, a fact I registered with a kind of dull, automatic dread, the muscle memory of 2.5 years spent charting and hoping and failing, built into my bones so deeply that even now, with a body I'd been told repeatedly had a diminished capacity for exactly this, my first reaction was not hope, but a kind of preemptive grief, bracing for the negative test before I'd even taken it. I bought 2 tests at the pharmacy near my apartment, the same brand I'd bought 24 times over during my marriage, and I sat on the edge of my bathtub for the requisite 3 minutes, with my eyes closed, because I could not bear to watch the little window resolve into one line, the way it always had. When I finally opened my eyes, there were 2 lines. Not faint, not ambiguous, not the kind of evaporation line Dr. Whitcomb had once had to explain wasn't real hope. 2 solid, unmistakable lines. I took the second test with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and it agreed with the first. I sat on the cold tile floor of my bathroom and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the night Grant handed me that manila envelope. Except this crying came from somewhere entirely different, somewhere that had nothing to do with loss. I didn't tell Caleb right away. I made an appointment with a new doctor first, terrified of hope, terrified of the particular cruelty of getting this far only to have it taken away by my own body the way everything else had been taken from me over the previous 3 years. Dr. Alvarez, warm and unhurried in a way Dr. Whitcomb had never quite managed to be, did an early ultrasound, and I watched her face carefully as she moved the wand, braced for the sympathetic, sorry tone I knew too well. Instead, she went quiet in a different way, leaning closer to the screen, and then she turned the monitor toward me. "Well," she said. "There's your first heartbeat," she said, pointing. "And there's your second." My whole body went cold and hot at once. "Twins," I said, the word barely audible. "Fraternal, looks like," she said, smiling now. "Given what's in your chart from your previous provider, I have to say, this is a wonderful surprise. Sometimes bodies do things we can't fully explain with the numbers on a chart." I sat in that exam room a long time after she left, staring at the grainy black and white image in my hand. 2 small, flickering shapes that no fertility specialist in the state had believed my body was capable of producing. And I laughed and cried at the same time until the nurse gently knocked to check I was all right. I drove straight to Cherry Street. Caleb was in his garage, sanding down a piece of reclaimed wood, sawdust caught in the gray at his temples, and when I got out of my car, he took one look at my face and set the sander down immediately, already crossing toward me. "Nora, what's wrong?" he said. And I realized I was crying and laughing in a way that must have looked, from the outside, exactly like something wrong. "Nothing's wrong," I managed. "Everything's right." I held out the ultrasound photo with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. He took it, and I watched his face change in slow motion. Confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to something I had never once seen on him before. A total, undefended, cracked open joy. "Twins," he said, his voice not quite steady. "Twins," I confirmed. He pulled me into him then, careful, like I might break, his chest rising and falling hard against my ear, and I felt something wet against the top of my head and understood, with a jolt, that Caleb Reyes, a man who had once described his own emotional register as tactical, was crying. The truth about Caleb came out in pieces, the way most important truths do. Not in one dramatic reveal, but in a slow accumulation of small inconsistencies I'd been too wrapped up in my own life to notice. There was the black SUV that occasionally idled outside his house for no reason I could identify, driven by men who nodded to him with a deference that seemed odd for consulting work. There was the encrypted laptop he was careful never to leave open on the kitchen table. There was the way, once, a man in an expensive suit had shown up at his door calling him Mr. Reyes, with a formality that made my skin prickle. And Caleb had stepped outside to talk to him rather than let him in. I finally asked him directly one evening in January, 7 months pregnant and past the point of tolerating vague answers about consulting work from the father of my unborn children. "Caleb," I said, over dinner at his kitchen island, "what do you actually do?" He set his fork down and looked at me for a long moment, and I understood I was finally being let through a door he'd kept closed for over a year. "After I left the Army," he said, "I started a small security consulting firm with 2 guys from my old unit. Threat assessment mostly, for companies worried about supply chain vulnerabilities, cyber intrusion risk, executive protection. It grew faster than any of us expected. It's called Sentinel Ridge now. We do work for about 40% of the Fortune 500 at this point." I stared at him. "Caleb," I said carefully, "how big is 40% of the Fortune 500? "Big enough that I don't think about money the way most people do," he said, watching my reaction with a wariness I recognized now as fear. Actual fear, from a man who did not otherwise seem to fear much of anything. "I never told you because I didn't want it to be part of why you looked at me the way you do. I've had money change how people treat me before. I didn't want that here, not with you." I laughed, a slightly hysterical sound, and he flinched at it before I managed to explain myself. "I'm not laughing at you," I said. "I'm laughing because I left a man who told me constantly how much he was worth and fell for one who apparently forgot to mention it." He almost smiled at that, the tension easing slightly from his shoulders. "How big?" I asked again, gently this time. Caleb told me a number, and I set my water glass down very carefully because my hands had started shaking. "Caleb," I said, "that's not company revenue. That's your personal net worth." He nodded, watching me carefully, waiting, I understood, for something in me to shift the way he must have watched it shift in other people once the number became real to them. It didn't shift. If anything, something in me settled more firmly into place. The last small worry I'd carried since Grant. The fear that I would never again trust my own judgment about a man's intentions, finally quieting. "You still fixed my greenhouse pane for free," I said. You still drove me to work in a 15-year-old truck. You could have told me any time in the last year and it wouldn't have changed a single thing I feel about you. Except maybe how furious I am that you let me worry about splitting a diner bill with a man who apparently owns a controlling stake in half the security infrastructure protecting downtown Denver. He laughed then, real and unguarded, and reached across the island for my hand. That's why I love you, he said, quiet and certain. It was the first time either of us had said the word out loud, and it landed exactly the way it should, unhurried, unforced, simply true. Word travels in Denver the way it travels in every city with old money pretending to be new and new money pretending to be old. And it wasn't long before it reached Grant, filtered through whatever remained of our overlapping social circle, that Nora Bennett was not only pregnant with twins, but engaged to a man whose company had, that same quarter, been the subject of a glowing feature in a national business magazine, a piece that had, until then, been the first time Caleb's face had appeared anywhere more public than a veterans charity newsletter. Dottie Marsh called me practically vibrating with the news before I'd even had the chance to read the article myself. "Nora," she said, breathless, "did you have any idea? The quiet man from Cherry Street is a billionaire. It says so right here in black and white. And I just think it's the most wonderful thing I've ever heard, after everything that terrible Ashford man put you through." Grant showed up at my design studio 3 weeks later, unannounced, in a suit that looked slightly less pristine than I remembered, his energy carrying a frayed edge I'd never once seen on him during our marriage. My receptionist, a sharp young woman named Priya, buzzed me with visible alarm. "There's a man here who says he's your ex-husband," she said. "He's being fairly insistent." I took a breath, one hand resting on the curve of my belly, and told her to send him in, because I was not, I decided in that moment, going to spend one more minute of my life afraid of Grant Ashford. He looked around my studio when he walked in, at the mood boards and fabric samples and the framed thank you letter from Renata's shelter on the wall, with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between contempt and grudging surprise. "Nora," he said, "you look well." "I don't have much time, Grant," I said, staying seated behind my desk, not offering him a chair. "What do you need?" He sat anyway, uninvited, and I watched him try to recalibrate, the way he must have recalibrated 1,000 times across 1,000 negotiating tables, searching for the angle. "I heard about the engagement," he said, "and the pregnancy. Congratulations, genuinely. I imagine this changes things." "Changes what things?" I asked, though I already knew exactly where this was going. He had the decency to look faintly embarrassed, which from Grant was nearly unprecedented. "The settlement," he said. "I've been thinking, given how things have played out, given that you're clearly," he gestured vaguely at my belly, "in a very different financial position now through your fiancé, it might make sense to revisit the original terms. Perhaps waive the remaining percentage owed. It seems unnecessary now, given your circumstances." I sat very still for a moment, letting the audacity of it settle fully into the room. "You came here," I said slowly, "to ask me to give back money you legally agreed to pay me because you found out the man I'm marrying is wealthier than you are." He had the grace, at least, to wince slightly at how it sounded said out loud. "It's not like that," he started. "It's exactly like that," I said. "Grant, I earned that settlement by giving 3 years of my life to a marriage where you made me feel like a defective business asset the day my numbers stopped serving your 5-year plan. I'm not renegotiating anything. If anything, My lawyer will be reviewing the original agreement to make sure every remaining dollar arrives on schedule. And I'd strongly recommend Aldridge advise you to comply, given that my fiancé's legal team has, I understand, a certain reputation for thoroughness. Something flickered across his face. Real fear this time, not performance. "You're threatening me," he said. "I'm informing you," I said, borrowing with some satisfaction the exact language he'd once used on me. "There's a difference." He stood, straightening his jacket with hands that weren't quite steady. "This isn't over," he said, a last, hollow attempt at the authority he'd once wielded so effortlessly over me. I looked at him, at this man who had once made me feel like a failed transaction, now standing in my office, asking for money back from a woman he'd discarded, and felt nothing but a clean, quiet certainty. "I think it is, actually," I said. "Priya will show you out." Grant's unraveling, when it came, arrived not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a slow, satisfying accumulation of consequences. The kind of thing you almost feel guilty enjoying until you remember exactly how you got a front row seat to it. It started with Bryn. 6 months pregnant with his child, she discovered, through a leaked internal email chain that made its way, with almost theatrical timing, into a local business blog, that Grant had been quietly meeting with a former Stanford classmate about a similar arrangement to the one he'd once described to his board as an aggressive but manageable cash flow gap, essentially bridging one investor's money to cover another investor's expected returns while the underlying product missed its projections 2 quarters running. It wasn't fraud yet, not technically, not in the way the SEC would eventually decide it was, but it was the kind of thing that made careful people start asking uncomfortable questions at exactly the moment Grant most needed them not to. Bryn left him 3 weeks after the story broke, taking her name off the wedding registry and, according to Dottie, who had somehow become plugged into a whole new circuit of gossip now that her old neighbor was famous by association, moving back in with her parents in Cherry Creek before the baby was even born. The Series C round Grant had bragged about at our final anniversary dinner never closed. The Meridian account he'd been so triumphant about that same night filed a breach of contract suit 8 months later, alleging he'd misrepresented the platform's security certifications. Certifications that, as it happened, had once been reviewed and flagged as inadequate by a threat assessment firm Grant's company had hired and then ignored. A firm called Sentinel Ridge, though neither Grant nor I ever spoke of the coincidence directly, because we both understood exactly what it meant, and neither of us needed to say it out loud. By the following spring, the company Grant had built his entire identity around was in receivership. The Range Rover was repossessed, the glass and concrete house on Cherry Street, the one I'd spent 2 years making beautiful, sold at a loss to cover legal fees, and Grant Ashford, whose name had once opened every door in Denver's tech scene, moved into a rented condo in a suburb he would have once considered beneath him, working, according to a piece of gossip Dottie relayed with barely concealed glee, as a consultant for a firm roughly 1/10 the size of the one he used to run. I felt, when I heard all this, not the vindictive triumph I might once have expected of myself, but something quieter and stranger, a kind of tired relief, the way you feel when a storm that's been threatening for days finally breaks and passes through, leaving the air clean behind it. Caleb never once gloated. When I told him about Grant's company folding, he simply nodded, the way he nodded at most news, and said, "Seems like the ROI wasn't there after all." A small, dry echo of the very words Grant had once used to end our marriage, and it was the closest thing to satisfaction I ever saw him allow himself over the whole business. I asked him once, much later, whether Sentinel Ridge's audit of Meridian security had really been a coincidence. He looked at me for a long moment, that same steady, unreadable look I'd learned meant he was deciding how much truth to give me. "I don't create problems for people, Nora," he said finally. "I just don't go out of my way to solve them for people who've hurt someone I love. Sometimes that's enough on its own." I let the answer stand, because some things, I was learning, were better left in the quiet space between full disclosure and willful not asking. Caleb proposed on an ordinary Wednesday, which felt, once I understood what was happening, exactly right for a man who had never once needed an elaborate gesture to prove the size of what he felt. I was 5 months pregnant, ankles swollen, sitting on his back porch steps after a long day of client meetings, complaining good-naturedly about a bathroom fixture that had failed to arrive on schedule for a shelter renovation, when he came out of the house carrying 2 mugs of decaf and set one down beside me without a word. I kept talking, mid-complaint about a supplier's unreliable freight schedule, until I noticed he wasn't drinking his coffee, wasn't saying anything at all, just watching me, with an expression I hadn't quite cataloged before, something between amusement and a carefully contained nervousness that looked almost foreign on a man I'd never once seen rattled by anything. Not a dying car on a flooded viaduct, not a tabloid photographer, not a board meeting worth more money than I could fully picture. "You're doing the thing," I said, stopping mid-sentence. "What thing?" he asked, though the corner of his mouth was already twitching. "The thing where you go quiet and I can tell you're about to say something you've clearly been rehearsing." He laughed, a short, startled sound, and reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt, and I understood, watching his hand emerge, that whatever he'd been rehearsing was about to become considerably harder to deliver with any composure at all. It wasn't a diamond, not the kind Grant would have chosen, an oversized, showy thing meant to be photographed rather than worn. It was a simple gold band, unadorned, and inside it, when he finally got the words out enough to hand it to me, I found a tiny inscription too small to read without my glasses, which he'd apparently anticipated because he'd also brought them out from the kitchen table, tucked into his other pocket. "It's from a section of an old engineering manual," he explained, while I fumbled the glasses on with hands that had started shaking. "Root systems establish stability before visible growth occurs. I found it years ago, before I even really knew you, and I don't know why I kept it, except that it felt true about more than plants." I read the tiny engraved words twice before I trusted myself to look up at him. "Nora," he said, and his voice, usually so level and unhurried, caught slightly on my name. "I've spent 6 years since Sarah died, believing the best I could offer anyone was competence. Fixed fences, reliable transportation, a pot with proper drainage. I never expected to want to offer someone my whole self again, unguarded, no tactical distance built in as a hedge against losing it all a second time. You didn't ask me to be anything other than exactly what I already was, and somehow that turned out to be the only thing that ever actually worked on me. I don't have a speech. I just have the truth, which is that I want to build the rest of this, all of it, the twins, whatever comes after, every ordinary Wednesday for the rest of both our lives, with you specifically, not with anyone else, not with any other version of how this could have gone. Marry me." I said yes before he'd fully finished the sentence, which made him laugh again, more freely this time, some of the careful tension finally draining out of his shoulders, and he slid the ring onto my finger with hands that weren't quite steady. The same hands that had once untangled a ruined lavender plant with total, unhurried composure, now visibly undone by something as ordinary as a porch step proposal to a very pregnant woman in work clothes. "I don't have a speech either," I told him, once I'd stopped laughing and crying in roughly equal measure. "I just have the fact that you've spent an entire year proving, one unglamorous, unasked-for kindness at a time, that showing up quietly and consistently is worth infinitely more than anything Grant ever said out loud with a ring twice this size. I'd have said yes to you in a beige apartment with $300 to my name and a single rosemary plant on the counter. This part's just easier, because I finally believe I deserve it." We told the twins that same evening they had, once they existed, insisted on referring to as babies, who apparently already had very strong opinions about kitchen noise levels, and Duke, sensing some shift in the household's emotional weather the way old dogs often do, spent the rest of the night pressed against my legs wherever I sat, as if personally overseeing the arrangement's stability. My mother cried on the phone when I called her, the good kind of crying this time, and asked, half joking, whether this meant she finally got to plan a wedding she wouldn't have to pretend to enjoy. A small, pointed reference to the tightly controlled, joyless affair Grant had insisted on for our first wedding, catered by a firm he'd chosen specifically for its exclusivity rather than its food. Our wedding, when it finally came, was small and unhurried, exactly the way Caleb did everything. We married in June, in the backyard of the Cherry Street house, under a canopy of the same lilac trees that had shaded the greenhouse whose broken pane had brought us together in the first place. I wore ivory, loose enough to accommodate the pronounced curve of my belly, and Renata cried openly through the entire ceremony, which she blamed on hormones she did not personally have, and Walt, from Alpine Trail Supply, gave a toast so earnest and rambling that half the guests were laughing and crying at the same time by the end of it. Caleb's old unit sent representatives, 3 men who greeted him with the particular wordless economy of people who'd survived something together, and who each, separately, pulled me aside at some point during the reception to tell me some small story about Caleb before Sarah's death, about Caleb after, about the man they'd watched slowly come back to himself over the years, each of them ending their story with some version of the same sentiment. We're glad he found his way back to something worth living for. Dottie Marsh, seated in the front row in a hat that could have qualified as its own architectural structure, sniffled loudly through the vows and cornered me at the reception to inform me, with the solemnity of a state announcement, that she had known, she had always known, there was something between Nora Bennett and that quiet man from the end of the street. She'd simply been waiting for the rest of us to catch up. I didn't correct her revised timeline of events. Some myths deserve to be left alone. Walt's rambling toast, the one that had half the guests laughing and crying simultaneously, ended with a line I've never forgotten, delivered in his gruff, unpracticed way with a beer bottle raised slightly too high. "I hired a woman once who could barely work a decade-old phone system," he said, "and I watched her build an entire company out of the wreckage of a bad marriage without ever once complaining to me about how unfair any of it was. Then I watched a man who fixes everything he touches fall in love with exactly that kind of stubborn. Seems like the right 2 people finally found each other. To Nora and Caleb, and to every broken thing that turns out, eventually, to have just been waiting on the right repair." Renata gave a shorter toast, tearful and fierce, thanking Caleb directly for the shelving units he'd built for free 2 years earlier, for showing up without being asked the way he always did. And Corinne, only weeks into her own transitional housing placement at the time, sat near the back of the ceremony at my specific invitation, watching quietly, and told me afterward it was the first wedding she'd ever attended where the love looked, in her words, like something built to actually hold weight, rather than something built to be photographed. We danced, at the reception, to a song neither of us had chosen carefully or strategically, something slow and unremarkable that happened to be playing when Caleb pulled me onto the small patch of lawn we'd cleared for dancing. And he held me the exact same way he'd once held both twins at once in the hospital. Careful, unhurried, entirely present. No part of his attention anywhere else in the world. I spent most of our first dance simply looking up at him, at this quiet, steady man who had once described himself as not very good with people, and thought about how completely, thoroughly he had proven that particular self-assessment wrong. One small act of showing up at a time, for over a year, without ever once asking anything in return. My mother flew in from Ohio, meeting Caleb for the first time 2 days before the wedding, and pulling me aside on the second night to tell me, with tears in her eyes, that she had spent 3 years watching me shrink smaller and smaller inside my marriage to Grant, without knowing how to say anything. And that watching me now, 7 months pregnant and glowing and unafraid in a way she hadn't seen since I was a girl, was the greatest relief of her life. I held on to that conversation for a long time afterward, because it confirmed something I'd suspected but never quite let myself believe. That the woman I'd been with Grant, careful and quiet and endlessly accommodating, had never actually been the whole of who I was. Only the smallest, safest sliver of it that his particular kind of coldness had left room for. There was a frightening stretch in my 3rd trimester, 6 weeks before the wedding date we'd originally planned, that neither of us talks about often, even now, but that shaped, in ways I only fully understood afterward, just how completely different this pregnancy was from the years of clinical disappointment that had preceded it. I was 32 weeks along when Dr. Alvarez, at a routine appointment, frowned slightly at the monitor and mentioned, in the same careful, unhurried tone doctors use when they don't yet want to alarm you, that one of the twins was measuring smaller than expected, and that she wanted to admit me for closer monitoring, possibly bed rest, possibly an earlier delivery than any of us had planned for. I called Caleb from the exam room, my voice steadier than I felt, and he arrived at the hospital before I'd even finished changing into the gown the nurse handed me, having apparently left a client call mid-sentence the moment he heard the word admit. He didn't panic, not visibly, not in any way the nursing staff could have detected, but I knew him well enough by then to read the particular stillness in his jaw, the same controlled focus I'd once glimpsed the night he mentioned looking into things regarding Grant, now aimed entirely at the 2 small heartbeats on the monitor beside my bed. He set up a folding cot in the corner of my hospital room without asking anyone's permission, informed Sentinel Ridge he'd be unreachable except for genuine emergencies for however long this took, and spent the better part of 4 days simply present, reading aloud from a battered paperback he found in the hospital gift shop, adjusting my pillows, negotiating with the cafeteria staff to get me something other than the bland, approved diet when my morale needed a genuine cheeseburger more than caution. The smaller twin, who would turn out to be Elias, stabilized by the 4th day, growth curve correcting itself enough that Dr. Alvarez, cautiously optimistic, downgraded me from full hospital admission to strict home bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. Caleb built, in the space of a single weekend, an entire downstairs bedroom conversion so I wouldn't need to manage stairs, complete with a small side table stocked permanently with water, snacks, and whatever design magazine I'd most recently mentioned wanting to read. A level of unglamorous hands-on caretaking that stood in such stark relief against 3 years of Grant's clinical detachment during my fertility struggles that I sometimes had to stop mid-conversation, overwhelmed by the specific, cumulative weight of being tended to by someone who never once made the tending feel like a burden. I asked him once, during that long stretch of forced stillness, how he managed to seem so calm through the whole thing, given how frightened I could tell he actually was underneath it. "Somebody has to hold the center," he said simply. I learned a long time ago that panicking doesn't change outcomes. It just makes the people around you feel less safe while you wait to find out what the outcome's going to be. I'd rather be useful to you scared than useless to you calm-looking. It wasn't performance, I understood, watching him closely over those weeks. It was the same steady, load-bearing competence he brought to everything, simply turned, now, entirely toward keeping our family safe, rather than toward some distant client's threat assessment. And I fell asleep most nights of that bed rest stretch to the quiet sound of him typing one-handed on his laptop in the corner cot, managing his company's transition with the other hand resting lightly on my hip, as if some part of him needed the physical confirmation, even in sleep, that all three of us were still exactly where we were supposed to be. The twins arrived 7 weeks after the wedding. 3 weeks early but strong and loud about it. A girl first, and then, 4 minutes later, a boy. Both of them with Caleb's dark hair and, the delivery nurse insisted, my stubborn set to the jaw already visible even in the first hour of life. We named the girl Josephine, after my grandmother, the one whose lemon bar recipe had started the whole slow unraveling of my old life the day I first thought to bring a plate of them across the fence to a quiet stranger. And the boy we named Elias, after Caleb's father, a name Caleb said out loud in the hospital room with the kind of reverence I'd never heard him use for anything else, not even Sentinel Ridge, not even the number attached to his own name in the business press. We'd argued gently in the weeks before delivery, over names, the ordinary, low-stakes kind of disagreement that felt almost luxurious after everything else we'd been through to get there. Caleb had wanted, at first, to avoid family names entirely, worried it would feel like assigning our children roles to fill rather than identities of their own to grow into. I understood the instinct and told him so. But I also told him about my grandmother, the one whose lemon bar recipe had started this entire unlikely chain of events. A woman who'd raised 4 children, essentially alone, after my grandfather's early death, and never once, in my memory of her, complained about the weight of it, only ever hummed while she worked, as if hardship were simply a rhythm to move through, rather than a tragedy to announce. I want a piece of her in this somewhere, I told him. Something that reminds our daughter, if we have one, that the women in this family have always found a way to keep the household standing, even when everything around them was falling down. Caleb had gone quiet at that, turning his own name suggestion over for a long moment before finally offering his father's name in return. Elias, a man Caleb rarely spoke about, who had died when Caleb was still deployed overseas, too far away to make it home for the funeral. A grief Caleb had told me about only once, briefly, in the same controlled, closed-door register he used for anything that still genuinely hurt to touch. My father built things his whole life, Caleb said. Furniture, mostly, out of a garage workshop that never made him much money but always made him proud. I think he'd have liked watching me build a family this specific and unlikely. I think he'd have liked you especially, actually. The way you don't let me get away with hiding behind competence instead of actually feeling things. We settled on Josephine for the little girl who arrived first, fierce and vocal about the whole process from her very first breath. And Elias for the boy who followed 4 minutes later, calmer, more deliberate, watching the delivery room with an already assessing stillness that made the nurse laugh and comment that he seemed to be taking inventory of the room before deciding whether to cry about any of it. Wren, when she came 3 years later, was named for no family reason at all. simply because Caleb had spotted one building its nest in the eave of our greenhouse the week we learned I was pregnant a third time. Small and unassuming, and stubbornly persistent, despite the odds against a nest built in that particular exposed corner, surviving a Colorado spring storm. And something about the image had lodged itself in both of us as exactly the right shape for whoever this third, unplanned, entirely welcome child would turn out to be. I remember, in the exhausted golden haze of that first night, watching Caleb hold both of our children at once, one in the crook of each arm, his enormous, scarred hands impossibly gentle, and thinking about the greenhouse pane, about roots and drainage and containers that finally break open, about a whole year of my life I had once believed was simply an ending, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that it had never been an ending at all. It had been the exact moment the right container finally found me. Those first months with the twins were a blur of feedings and exhaustion so total, it rearranged my entire sense of time. But they were also, unexpectedly, some of the most peaceful months of my adult life. Because for the first time in years, I was exhausted in a house where nobody made me feel like my exhaustion was an inconvenience to somebody else's schedule. Caleb had told Sentinel Ridge's board, 3 weeks before the twins were born, that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations, promoting his second-in-command, a sharp, capable woman named Priyanka, who had been with the company almost since its founding, and retaining only a seat on the board and final say over anything touching the firm's founding principles. He didn't announce it with any fanfare. He simply came home one evening and told me it was done, the way he told me everything, a fact delivered plainly, its weight already absorbed. "You didn't have to do that," I said, watching him settle onto the couch, Josephine already asleep against his chest in the particular boneless way newborns sleep, as if gravity itself had negotiated a truce with them. "I know," he said. "I wanted to. I spent 6 years after Sarah died building something, because building things was the only way I knew how to keep moving. I don't need to keep proving I can build anymore. I'd rather be here when Elias says his first word than read about it in a text message from a nanny." I looked at him, at this man worth more money than I would ever fully understand, choosing, without a flicker of hesitation, 3 a.m. feedings and diaper changes over boardrooms, and thought again about how completely, catastrophically wrong Grant had been about what a man's ambition was actually supposed to be in service of. The first real scare came when the twins were 4 months old. A tabloid gossip site, having gotten wind of Caleb's engagement and quiet marriage the year before, through the same business press that had first outed his net worth, ran a piece speculating, with almost no factual basis, about the security of what they called the Reyes fortune, publishing, among other things, a photo of our house taken with a long lens from a public road and a grainy shot of me pushing the twin stroller through the reservoir park where Caleb and I had once chased down a runaway duke. I found the article myself, scrolling through my phone at 2 a.m. during a feeding, and felt something cold and violating settle into my chest that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. Caleb's reaction when I showed him the next morning was immediate and entirely without drama, which somehow made it more reassuring than any amount of reassurance could have. He made 2 phone calls before he'd finished his coffee. By that afternoon, there was a discreet security detail rotating through the neighborhood in unmarked vehicles, men and women I only ever noticed because I'd learned, over a year with Caleb, to notice the particular stillness of people who were paid to notice everything. The long-lens photographer was identified within the week, traced through a licensing dispute with the tabloid's parent company that Sentinel Ridge's legal team, apparently, had significant leverage over, and the outlet issued a quiet retraction, along with an agreement never to publish images of our children. I asked Caleb how exactly that leverage had worked, and he gave me the same answer he'd given about Meridian. "I don't create problems for people," he said. "I just make sure the ones who create problems for my family understand the cost clearly enough to reconsider." I decided, again, that this was an answer I was content to leave exactly where it was. Bennett Transitional Design grew faster than I ever could have planned for, in the strange, almost embarrassing way that things sometimes grow once the fear that's been strangling them finally lets go. The shelter work with Renata led to a contract with the city, redesigning intake spaces across 4 facilities using the trauma-informed principles I'd taught myself out of library books during my loneliest year. And the city contract led, 18 months later, to a call from the governor's office, exploring a statewide pilot program applying the same design principles to transitional housing for veterans exiting homelessness, a subject I didn't need to point out to anyone that had a particular resonance in our own household. I brought Caleb in as an unpaid advisor on that project, not for his money, though the foundation we eventually established together, the Sentinel Bennett Housing Initiative, would ultimately fund a significant portion of it. But because nobody understood better than he did what it actually felt like to come home from something unspeakable and need a space that didn't ask you to perform normalcy you didn't yet feel. He walked the pilot units with me before they opened, adjusting sight lines, flagging a hallway configuration that would trigger hypervigilance in someone with combat-related hypervigilance, suggesting a reading nook be moved so it faced the door rather than the window. Small, invisible interventions that made an entire difference to someone whose nervous system had learned, the hard way, to always know where the exits were. We were profiled, eventually, in a national design magazine, a feature that Caleb had initially resisted and ultimately agreed to only because Renata argued, correctly, that visibility meant funding, and funding meant more rooms for more people who needed exactly what we were building. The photographer wanted us posed formally, and Caleb, characteristically, redirected the entire shoot to the reservoir park instead, insisting the real story was the work, not the two of us standing stiffly in front of it. The resulting piece led with a photograph of me kneeling beside a mock-up of a shelter bedroom, adjusting a lamp, Caleb visible in soft focus in the background, holding a very determined toddler Josephine, who had insisted on carrying her own small screwdriver like her father's. The article's closing line, drawn from an offhand comment Caleb made near the end of a long interview he'd clearly been uncomfortable with the entire time, quoted him simply, "My proudest investment has always been my wife's ability to build something better out of whatever's left over." He hadn't told me he'd said it. He simply lived it, every single day, in 100 small, unremarkable ways, until I read it in print with tears blurring the page at my own desk. The twins turned 2 the same month I filmed a segment for a Denver morning show about the pilot housing project, a fact I only mentioned because of what happened during the commercial break. I was in the green room, going over talking points with the producer, when a young production assistant knocked, visibly nervous, and told me there was a man outside asking for 5 minutes, insisting he knew me. "What's his name?" I asked, already feeling a cold certainty settle low in my stomach before she even answered. "Grant," she said. "Grant Ashford." I felt in that moment not fear but a flare of pure annoyance, the kind you feel at an insect that's found its way indoors again despite every window being shut. I glanced toward the studio door, where I knew, without needing to check, that at least one member of the discreet security detail Caleb insisted on whenever I traveled for the firm's work was stationed, close enough to intervene, far enough to stay invisible to the cameras. I was safe. More than safe. I was, for the first time in my dealings with Grant Ashford, entirely in control of the room. "Tell him I'm not available," I said, my voice even. "And if he doesn't leave the premises immediately, Security will escort him out, and if he returns, the next call will be to the police." The assistant scurried off, looking relieved to have an answer at all. I took one steadying breath, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked back out to rejoin the host with a bright, entirely professional smile. "Sorry about that," I said. "Shall we pick up where we left off?" Marcus, the head of my personal security detail, a broad, unhurried man who had worked for Caleb since Sentinel Ridge's earliest days, confirmed it afterward. "It was him," Marcus said. "Left the second we approached. Won't be back, ma'am." I nodded, because I already knew he was right. The man who had once held every ounce of power in my life, who had decided over a tiramisu he barely touched that I was a loss worth cutting, was now nothing more than a sad, diminished figure haunting the edges of a life he'd once thrown away without a second thought. And I was far too busy building the actual future to spend any more of myself being haunted by it. The gnat had been swatted, and I hadn't even needed to lift my own hand to do it. Our third child, a girl we named Wren, arrived a little under 3 years after the twins, a smaller, calmer baby than either of her siblings had been, content to watch the chaos of the household from whatever lap happened to be nearest, as if she'd taken one look at Josephine and Elias's combined energy and decided, wisely, to conserve her own. By then we had moved from the Cherry Street house, which had grown too small for a family of 5 plus Duke, now impossibly old and slow, but stubbornly, gratefully still with us, to a larger property outside the city with better schools and enough land for the elaborate greenhouse Caleb built me as a wedding anniversary gift. Tempered glass throughout, engineered, he told me with visible pride, never to crack in a Colorado winter again. Life with 3 children under 6 was, in the best and most honest sense of the word, chaos. But it was purposeful chaos, chosen chaos. Nothing at all like the careful, brittle silence I had once mistaken for a marriage. Josephine, at 5, was fiercely, almost alarmingly articulate, prone to correcting adults' vocabulary at the dinner table and building elaborate structures out of whatever materials were nearest to hand. Currently engaged in a running argument with her brother Elias over the structural integrity of a fort made from couch cushions in the living room. Elias, quieter and more methodical, like his father, tended to simply rebuild whatever his sister knocked down, patient in a way that made Caleb watch him sometimes with an expression I recognized because I wore it myself. A kind of quiet disbelief that something this good could exist because of a life that had once felt entirely, permanently broken. Bennett Transitional Design, which I had, after some debate, kept under my own professional name as a nod to the whole strange journey, now employed 14 people and carried a 2-year waiting list for its full design consultations. The trauma-informed housing framework I'd started teaching myself out of library books had become a phrase now used, somewhat to my own disbelief, in architectural journals and university design programs. The governor's pilot project had led to a broader statewide initiative, and I had recently returned from speaking at a national conference on housing policy, an experience that would have been, in my former life with Grant, unthinkable. A woman who once couldn't get her own name on a joint checking account, now advising state agencies on how best to house people rebuilding their lives from nothing. Because I understood, better than most consultants ever could, exactly what that particular kind of rebuilding felt like from the inside. I was pouring a second cup of coffee one Tuesday morning when my assistant Priya's name flashed on my phone. "Nora," she said, "I have the final numbers on the Wren House expansion in 5 points. City Council approved full funding this morning." A warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the coffee. We'd named that particular shelter after our youngest, at Renata's insistent suggestion, and its expansion would mean 20 more beds. 20 more women given a room designed deliberately to feel like the beginning of something, instead of the tail end of a disaster. "That's the 4th facility this year," I said. "Forward me the paperwork. I'll review it tonight." Caleb came up behind me as I hung up, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder in the particular unhurried way that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "Another one," he said, not really a question. "Another one," I confirmed. 20 more families get a real start." He kissed the side of my head. "I've officially delegated the entire world-saving operation to very capable younger people," he said. "I'm now exclusively the Chief Logistics Officer of Reyes-Bennett Family Operations, full-time." "And what does that job actually entail?" I asked, turning in his arms. "It means I get to say no to any contract that would take me away from bedtime stories," he said, entirely serious. "It means I coach Elias's soccer team badly and let Josephine win at chess only about 40% of the time because she needs to learn to lose occasionally. And it means Wren has already decided I'm the only acceptable person to braid her hair, for reasons neither of us have figured out yet." I laughed, leaning into him, and thought, not for the first time, about how completely, thoroughly wrong I had once been about what a successful man's priorities were supposed to look like. There was a stretch of that first year with Caleb, before the wedding, before I even knew about Sentinel Ridge, when I nearly let fear talk me out of the whole thing. It happened on a Sunday morning in late summer, maybe 8 months after the divorce, when Caleb had invited me to a small barbecue at a fellow veteran's house, my first real exposure to the community he rarely mentioned, but clearly still moved through with quiet, steady loyalty. I stood in a stranger's backyard holding a lemonade, watching Caleb crouch beside a folding table, helping a man missing half his left leg adjust the leg of his prosthesis with the same unhurried precision he'd once used to reframe my greenhouse. And I felt, unexpectedly, like an intruder in a language I didn't speak. A woman named Denise, married to one of the men in Caleb's old unit, found me standing alone near the drink cooler and, without much preamble, said, "You're the one from Cherry Street, aren't you? The one he talks about." "I didn't know he talked about me at all," I admitted. Denise laughed, not unkindly. "Caleb doesn't talk about much of anything," she said. "That's sort of his whole deal. But my husband says he's been different since he met you. Lighter." We weren't sure Caleb Reyes had a lighter setting left in him after Sarah, if I'm honest. I looked over at him again, at the easy, patient way he moved through a yard full of people who had all, in their own ways, survived something, and felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. "What was he like?" I asked, before. And Denise studied me for a moment before answering. "Steadier than most people," she said finally. "Kinder than he let on. But there was a wall around him for years, and I don't think anybody expected it to come down. It clearly has, though, watching him with you today. I've never seen him laugh that easily." That night, driving home, I told Caleb about the conversation, half expecting him to retreat into the guarded stillness that was so often his default when the subject turned to Sarah, to grief, to the years he'd spent essentially alone on Cherry Street, fixing things for neighbors as a substitute for fixing himself. He was quiet for a long stretch of highway before he answered. "I used to think being useful was the same thing as being healed," he said finally. "I could fix anyone's fence, anyone's greenhouse, anyone's stalled car, and it let me feel like I was still a person who mattered, without ever having to actually let anyone close enough to see how much of me Sarah's death had taken with her. You were the first person in 6 years I wanted to let see the rest of it." I didn't decide that. It just happened, the way weather happens. I don't fully understand it, but I stopped needing to understand it to trust it. I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, especially during the strange, vertiginous weeks after Caleb finally told me the true scale of Sentinel Ridge, because it reminded me that whatever fear I felt about the money, about the sudden visibility, about a life so different from the quiet, careful existence I'd built for myself out of the wreckage of my marriage, none of it changed the fundamental fact underneath. Caleb Reyes had let me see him first, before any of it. Broken and grieving and stubbornly, quietly kind. And everything that came after was simply more of that same steady truth, scaled up. My mother, during that same visit before the wedding, told me a story I'd never heard before, about my father, who had died when I was 19. A story about the early years of their marriage, before money, before any real security, when he'd fixed the transmission on their only car himself in a Nebraska winter rather than let them go into debt for a mechanic's bill. Your father wasn't a wealthy man a single day of his life, she said, but he never once made me feel poor, because he never once made how much we had the measure of how much I mattered to him. Caleb reminds me of him, more than I think you realize. I don't say that lightly, Nora. I've watched you shrink for 3 years with a man who counted everything, and now I'm watching you grow with one who doesn't seem to count anything at all, except how many times a day he can make you laugh. There was, later that same year, an unexpected postscript to the whole business with Grant that I hadn't anticipated, and that closed a loop I didn't even know was still open. Bryn, his former fiancé, reached out to me directly, nearly a year after their engagement ended, through a message sent to my design studio's general inbox rather than anything more personal. Careful, tentative, apologizing for the intrusion, explaining that she'd had Grant's daughter, a girl she was raising alone in a small apartment near the airport, working 2 jobs to make ends meet after Grant's business collapsed and his support payments became, in her words, unreliable at best. She wasn't asking for money. She said she'd heard, through the same overlapping circles that carried all Denver gossip eventually, about the trauma-informed shelter work I did, and she wondered, given everything, whether I might have any advice, or any openings, for a single mother trying to rebuild a life from very little. I sat with that message for a long time before responding, turning over every complicated feeling it stirred up, the strange symmetry of it. The woman Grant had left me for, now finding herself abandoned by the very same coldness that had once been aimed at me. I could have ignored it. Some petty, still healing part of me wanted to. Instead, I called Renata, and within a month, Bryn had a part-time administrative position at the 5 Points shelter. The same kind of unglamorous, steadying work Walt had once offered me when I had nothing else. And within a year, she'd enrolled in the same design certification program I'd once cobbled together out of library books and late nights. Because watching the work up close, she told me once, over coffee neither of us had expected to be sharing, had shown her there was a whole different way to measure what a life amounted to than the one Grant had taught both of us, in his own particular ways, to fear. I don't tell you this to suggest I became some kind of saint about it, because I wasn't. And there were nights I lay awake resenting the universe's sense of humor and putting Bryn's careful, grateful emails in my inbox at all. But there was something quietly, permanently satisfying about watching 2 women Grant Ashford had discarded for entirely different reasons, one for failing to conceive fast enough, and one, presumably, for the crime of eventually becoming pregnant and inconvenient in her own way, build something sturdy and real out of the wreckage he'd left behind. Without him, and very much in spite of him. We honeymooned in September, once the twins were old enough for my mother to take for a week, without either of us worrying ourselves sick over it. a modest cabin outside Ridgeway that Caleb had rented under a name that wasn't his own. A small habit of privacy I'd come to understand wasn't paranoia so much as simple practicality for a man whose face had recently started appearing, unwillingly, in business press he'd never asked to be featured in. We hiked in the mornings, the mountains still holding on to the last of summer's green before the aspens turned. And in the evenings, we sat on the cabin's narrow porch with mugs of coffee, watching the light change over the San Juans. And I found myself, more than once, simply staring at him, at the specific miracle of a life that had somehow arrived at this: a porch, a mountain, a husband who had never once made me feel like a line item. "Do you remember what you said the day the greenhouse pane broke?" I asked him one of those evenings, half teasing. "You told me the frame would keep doing that every winter until I reframed it properly." He considered this with the same seriousness he gave everything. "I remember thinking," he said finally, "that you looked like someone who'd spent a long time being told the problem was hers to fix alone, when the actual problem was the frame the whole time. I just didn't think it was my place to say all that to a woman I'd known for exactly 4 minutes, so I said something about aluminum expansion instead." I laughed, leaning into his shoulder. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and it was disguised as a physics lecture," I said. He kissed the top of my head. "Most of the important things I've ever said to you have been disguised as something else," he admitted. "I'm working on that." "You're doing fine," I told him, and meant it completely. There was a harder night on that same trip, one I think about now with a kind of tenderness I couldn't have accessed the first year I knew him. We'd been talking, easily, about nothing in particular, when Caleb went, suddenly, completely still, in a way I recognized from the rare occasions grief caught him off guard, and told me it was the anniversary, the actual date, 6 years exactly, since Sarah had died. I hadn't known. "I don't usually say anything," he admitted. "It felt strange not to, this year, having someone to say it to." I didn't try to fill the silence that followed with reassurance he hadn't asked for. I just took his hand, the way he'd once simply started loading boxes into a U-Haul without asking a single question, and let the quiet do whatever work it needed to do. "After a long while," he said, "I used to think loving you would feel like some kind of betrayal of her memory. It doesn't. It feels like the version of my life she'd have wanted for me, if she'd had any say in how the rest of it went. I think she'd have liked you. I think she'd have told you to make me build that greenhouse faster, because apparently I take too long deciding things." I laughed through unexpected tears, and he pulled me closer, and we sat like that until the mountain cold finally drove us inside. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, more than anything else, sturdy. The specific sturdiness of a life built on choices rather than obligations. Caleb coached soccer, badly and lovingly. I took on board seats at 2 national housing nonprofits, my name now carrying enough weight in the field that I occasionally had to remind myself with real surprise that I was the same woman who had once fumbled a decade-old phone system at a gear distributor near the rail yards, answering calls with a chirpy greeting that had felt, at the time, like the absolute floor of what my life could still amount to. Duke passed peacefully in his sleep the winter wren turned 2, and we buried him under the lilac trees at the Cherry Street house, which we'd kept, unable quite to sell it, renting it out to a young couple who reminded us, in some indefinable way, of who we'd both once been. Dottie Marsh, who had appointed herself the unofficial historian of Cherry Street's entire social ecosystem, tracked us down periodically with updates nobody had asked for, but that I'd come, over the years, to find oddly comforting in their reliability. She called the week after Wren's second birthday to report, with barely contained relish, that Grant Ashford had been seen, of all places, working the counter at a hardware store in a small town outside Colorado Springs. Having relocated there, apparently, after the last of his legal troubles finally resolved, quietly, unglamorously, in a settlement that stripped him of most of what remained of his once formidable fortune. "I heard he actually seems decent at it," Dottie reported, sounding almost disappointed by the mundane ordinariness of it. "Not that anyone deserves a redemption arc after what he did to you. But I suppose stranger things have happened." I found, listening to her, that I genuinely didn't feel much of anything about the news at all. Neither triumph nor pity, just the mild, distant interest you might feel hearing about a stranger. Which struck me, afterward, as the truest measure of how completely Grant Ashford had stopped mattering to the actual architecture of my life. The hardest professional stretch came the year the twins turned 4, when a rival housing consultancy, threatened by the momentum our foundation had built across 3 states, planted a story with a regional news outlet questioning whether the Sentinel Bennett Housing Initiative's funding model amounted to little more than a wealthy husband buying his wife a vanity project dressed up as social good. A piece that used, with what felt like deliberate cruelty, an old, unflattering photograph of Caleb from his darkest year after Sarah's death, and quoted an anonymous source describing our marriage as suspiciously fast, given the disparity in our former circumstances. I read the piece standing in my studio kitchen, feeling something old and familiar rise in my chest. The particular helplessness of watching a narrative about your own life get written by someone who had never once asked you a real question. Caleb found me there 20 minutes later, my phone still open to the article, my hands shaking in a way that took me straight back to a bathroom floor and 2 pink lines and years of feeling like my worth was perpetually up for external evaluation. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening slightly at the photograph, and then he set the phone down and asked, not "what should we do," but "what do you need right now?" "I need it to not be true," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "It isn't true," he said simply, "but I understand that doesn't make reading it feel any different." We didn't respond publicly, not right away, which went against every instinct I had left over from years of feeling I needed to defend myself against every accusation leveled my way. Instead, Caleb asked Renata, and 3 shelter directors from other cities we'd funded, and Priyanka from Sentinel Ridge, and even, unexpectedly, my own mother, whether they'd be willing to speak on the record. Not in Caleb's defense, and not really in mine, but simply about the actual work, the actual outcomes, the actual families housed. The resulting follow-up piece, published 2 weeks later in a far more reputable outlet after one of the original story's sources recanted under scrutiny, ran with data instead of speculation. Occupancy outcomes and recidivism reductions, and a direct quote from a woman named Teresa, a formerly homeless veteran housed through our program in Colorado Springs, who said simply, "I don't care who's funding it or why. I care that the room they gave me had a door that locked from the inside for the first time in 3 years. And that's not nothing." I taped that quote to the wall above my desk, and I think about it more than I think about almost anything else connected to the entire ugly episode. Because it reminded me, in a way the original attack piece had briefly made me forget, that the actual measure of a life well built was never going to be found in anyone else's narrative about it. Least of all, a narrative constructed by people who'd never once had to rebuild anything from nothing themselves. That same year brought gentler chapters too, the kind that don't make headlines but make up the actual texture of a life. Josephine's first day of kindergarten, where she informed her new teacher within the first 10 minutes that her structural block designs were, in fact, engineering, not toys. A distinction the teacher apparently found delightful enough to mention at our first parent-teacher conference. Elias's quiet, single-minded devotion to a stray cat that showed up at our back door one October and simply never left. A cat he named with characteristic bluntness, Cat, and fed so faithfully that Cat eventually outweighed Duke's old food bowl by a considerable margin. Wren's first full sentence, delivered with great solemnity at 18 months. Not mama or dada, but apparently, "More dirt, please," uttered while standing in the greenhouse watching Caleb repot a tray of seedlings, which we took, collectively, as a promising early sign about which parent's hobbies she intended to inherit. Christmas that year was loud and enormous. Both families crowded into the house outside the city. My mother flown in from Ohio, 3 of Caleb's old unit brothers and their families invited because, as Caleb put it, family isn't only the people you're related to, it's the people who showed up when it mattered. And every single person in this kitchen showed up for one or both of us when it mattered most. I watched Denise, the same woman who'd told me at that first barbecue years earlier that she'd never seen Caleb laugh so easily, sit at our kitchen island helping Wren decorate cookies with a level of concentration usually reserved for far more consequential tasks, and thought about how far the distance had actually been. Not in miles, but in kind, between that kitchen and the one I'd once stood in on Cherry Street, cataloging certifications like proof of a worth nobody around me seemed willing to grant freely. 5 years after our wedding, the twins were nearly 8, sharp and opinionated and prone to elaborate joint schemes that usually ended with one of them needing a bandage. And Wren, at 4, had become exactly the small, fierce shadow of her father everyone had predicted, following him around the greenhouse with her own child-sized tools, narrating his every move with total confidence regardless of accuracy. I was reviewing blueprints on my tablet one Saturday morning when Josephine appeared in the doorway of my home office, hands on hips, indignant. "Mommy, Elias took my geodesic prototype apart," she announced. "It's not a prototype, Grace. Josephine, sorry. It's your brother's turn to build," I said, catching myself mid-correction, because I'd been rereading old notes about a family from a shelter case study named Grace that morning, and the name had lodged itself in my head. Elias, give your sister 2 of the blocks back," I called toward the living room. "Josephine, use your words instead of your volume to explain why you need them." Caleb's voice came from the office doorway a moment later, amused. "The Ridgeline account is fully closed out," he said. "Audit passed at 99.6%. Priyanka doesn't need me for anything else this quarter, which means, effective as of about 5 minutes ago, I am officially, completely, no takebacks, retired from Sentinel Ridge." He leaned against the doorframe, watching the block dispute resolve itself in the next room with the quiet contentment that had become, over the years, his default resting state. Wren barreled past his legs a moment later, clutching a stuffed dog she'd named, with total lack of originality and total sincerity. Duke Jr. "Daddy, Duke Jr. is hungry," she announced. The real cat, now enormous and thoroughly settled into his role as the household's least useful resident, lifted his head from the sunny spot on the rug, gave one unimpressed blink, and went back to sleep. This was our life, loud and unpredictable and entirely, deliberately chosen, and I would not have traded a single chaotic minute of it for the careful, silent order I'd once mistaken for security. There was one piece of unfinished business Caleb had kept from me for nearly the whole 5 years, revealed finally that same spring in a way that undid me completely. He'd bought, quietly, one property at a time over 4 years, using a holding company Priyanka managed so carefully that even I hadn't connected the dots. The entire block of Cherry Street. Our old street. The townhouses, the vacant lot at the corner, even, eventually, the glass and concrete house I'd once tried and failed to make into a home with Grant. "What are you going to do with an entire block of Cherry Street?" I finally asked him, when the last piece of the puzzle, our old greenhouse house included, had quietly closed escrow. He'd smiled, that same rare, unguarded smile I'd first seen the day Duke bolted after a squirrel. "Come see," he said, and drove me over one Sunday afternoon, the kids buckled in the back arguing amicably about something involving dinosaurs. The transformation stopped me cold the moment we turned onto the street. The row houses had been converted into affordable rental units, the kind reserved specifically for teachers and nurses and shelter caseworkers, people who kept a city functioning without ever earning enough to actually live in it. Each unit renovated using the exact trauma-informed principles I'd built my entire career around. Soft sightlines, controllable light, doors that locked securely from the inside. The vacant lot at the corner, and the yard where Grant's obnoxious boxwood hedge had once stood in rigid, humorless rows, had become a small, vivid park, a playground, a communal garden already thick with tomato vines and sunflowers planted by the new residents, and the modest engraved sign near the entrance that read, simply, Cherry Street Commons. We were there, that particular Sunday, for the dedication of a new play structure funded through our foundation, a wooden climbing tower with a slide shaped like a curling wave that Elias declared, after one test run, to be superior in every respect to the couch cushion fort back home. As the kids ran shrieking toward it, an older woman approached slowly, walking a small, indignant Pomeranian on a rhinestone leash, and it took me a moment to place her, softer and grayer than I remembered, but unmistakably Dottie Marsh. "Nora," she said, one hand pressed dramatically to her chest. "And Caleb, my goodness, look at your beautiful family." Her gaze swept over the whole scene, the laughing children, the vibrant garden beds where that awful hedge had once stood, and something that looked almost like tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "What you've done here," she said. "It's a miracle, truly. We had no idea, none of us, what that man was really like underneath. We were all taken in, same as you." "It was a long time ago, Dottie," I said, and I meant it. No bitterness in the words at all anymore. "Did you hear?" she said, lowering her voice to her customary conspiratorial register. "He's out there in Buena Vista now, of all places, still working the hardware store counter last I heard." "I'm glad he's found some kind of peace," I said, and to my own quiet surprise, I mostly meant that too. Grant Ashford had become, over the years, a footnote, a cautionary tale from a life that belonged to a version of me I barely recognized anymore. Someone who had once believed her entire worth was measured out in a laboratory's percentages. Dottie nodded, visibly a little disappointed there was no fresh scandal to be had, and wandered off toward the garden beds to admire someone's prize-winning tomatoes. That same spring, on what would have been Sarah's birthday, Caleb asked, tentatively, almost shy in a way I rarely saw from him anymore, whether I'd bring the kids to the small cemetery outside Fort Carson where she was buried. He'd gone alone every year before we married, a private ritual he'd never invited anyone into, and the fact that he was asking now, 5 years into our marriage, felt like a door opening rather than closing. the opposite of what I might once have feared such a request could mean. "Of course," I said. "I'd love to meet her, in whatever way that's still possible." We drove down on a clear, bright morning, the kids uncharacteristically subdued in the back seat, sensing, without being told exactly, that this particular outing carried a different weight than our usual weekend trips. Caleb knelt at the modest granite marker, brushing away a season's worth of fallen cottonwood fluff with the same careful, unhurried precision he brought to everything, and told the kids, in simple, gentle language, that Sarah had been someone he loved very much, a long time ago, before any of them existed, and that a person could carry more than one great love in a lifetime without it taking anything away from either one. Josephine, characteristically direct, asked whether that meant Sarah was like a first draft of their family. Caleb laughed, a real, startled laugh, and told her that was, in its own strange way, exactly right, though he thought Sarah would have found the engineering metaphor very funny. I stood back at first, giving him space, but he reached out and drew me down beside him at the grave, his hand finding mine over the cool granite. "Thank you for letting them exist," he said quietly, meaning, I understood, something far larger than the sentence itself contained. "Thank you for building a life that made room for all of this. Thank you for teaching me that grief and joy could coexist in the same chest without one having to defeat the other." "I don't think I ever really thanked her either," I said. "If she hadn't shaped you into the man who'd stop and help a stranger with a broken pot, I don't know who I'd have become." We knelt there together a long while, the kids eventually wandering off to examine a nearby stand of ponderosa pine, and I understood, watching Caleb's shoulders finally loosen in a way I'd rarely seen even after 5 years of marriage, that this had been its own kind of drainage, the release of a grief he'd been quietly, faithfully carrying alone for far too long, finally allowed to run somewhere other than straight down into rot. There was a client story from that same period I still think about more than almost any other from the whole span of my career, because it crystallized, more clearly than any magazine feature or grant announcement ever could, exactly why the work mattered. A woman named Corinne came through the 5 Points shelter that winter, 3 months pregnant, having fled a marriage that had, in its own quieter way, been just as corrosive as mine, though hers had carried the added danger of actual violence rather than merely cold calculation. Renata brought her by the studio one afternoon, hoping I might help design her transitional unit, and Corinne, sitting stiffly on the edge of a chair in my office, apologized 3 times in the first 5 minutes for taking up my time. I recognized something of my own old self in the reflex of it, the automatic smallness, the instinct to make yourself less of an inconvenience, even while asking for the most basic form of help. I didn't tell her my own story outright. Not that day. It wasn't the moment for it. But I designed her unit the way I designed all of them. A door that locked securely, a window with a clear sight line to the street, so she'd always be able to see who was approaching. Warm light instead of the harsh fluorescence most shelters defaulted to. A small reading nook positioned so it faced the entrance rather than the wall. Corinne moved in 3 weeks later and had her daughter that spring, and stayed connected to the shelter's aftercare program long enough that I watched her, over the following 2 years, complete a certificate program of her own in early childhood education, and eventually take a full-time position at a daycare not far from the very shelter that had first taken her in. She sent me a card the following winter, unprompted, with a photograph of her daughter's first birthday party, and a note that read simply, "You built me a room that told me I mattered before I believed it myself." I don't think I'd have found my way back to believing it without that. I taped that card to the wall above my desk, right next to Teresa's quote from the housing controversy the year before, and told myself, on the harder days, the days when funding fell through or a city council meeting ran 4 hours too long, that this, exactly this, was the entire reason any of it was worth doing. I ran into Dr. Whitcomb entirely by accident the autumn Josephine and Elias started 3rd grade, of all places, at a farmer's market near the old Cherry Street neighborhood, both of us reaching for the same bin of heirloom tomatoes. She recognized me before I recognized her. Older now, silver threading fully through hair that had only been graying at the temples when I'd last sat in her exam room, feeling like a failed statistic. "Nora Bennett," she said, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, is it still Bennett?" "Reyes now," I said, "and Bennett, professionally. It's a long story." She smiled, the same gentle, careful smile she'd once used to deliver news I hadn't wanted to hear. "I actually read about your foundation in a journal a colleague passed around," she said. "I recognized your name, and I'll admit, I wondered whether you'd ever gotten the family you wanted." "I have 3 children," I told her, watching her expression shift into something like genuine professional astonishment. "Twins first, naturally, then a 3rd a few years later." She was quiet a moment, processing this against whatever numbers still lived in some old chart in some old file cabinet. "I'm so glad," she said finally, and I could tell she meant it, completely, unconditionally, though threaded through with the particular humility doctors carry when a body defies the numbers they were trained to trust. "Bodies surprise us more than we like to admit," she said. "I'm glad yours had more to say than my chart did." I told her about Dr. Alvarez's ultrasound, about 2 heartbeats where 20 years of data had insisted there'd likely be none. And Dr. Whitcomb laughed, a real laugh, and said she was going to tell that story to every anxious 35-year-old who sat across from her for the rest of her career. Because sometimes, hope deserved better odds than a chart could calculate. The foundation held its 5-year anniversary gathering that same fall, a modest event by the standards of Denver's usual glossy nonprofit galas, held not in some downtown ballroom, but in the communal garden at Cherry Street Commons itself. Folding tables strung with simple lights, food from a caterer Renata insisted on hiring specifically because he'd once been a client of ours himself, a man who'd gone through the shelter's transitional program 8 years earlier and built, from nothing, a small catering business that now served half the nonprofit events in the city. Caleb gave a short, characteristically understated speech, mostly statistics, families housed, recidivism reduced, wait lists shortened, before handing the microphone quickly back to Renata, visibly more comfortable discussing threat matrices than standing in front of a crowd praising him personally. I spoke last, looking out at a garden full of people whose lives had intersected with ours in 100 different ways. Walt from Alpine Trail Supply, who'd driven up from the shop just for the evening. Denise and her family. Corinne with her now toddler daughter perched on one hip. Even, unexpectedly, Bryn, who'd brought her own daughter along and stood near the back, looking a little uncertain of her welcome until I made a point of crossing the garden to greet her directly, in front of everyone. Because some kindnesses are worth performing publicly precisely so nobody watching has to wonder whether grace has limits. I told the gathered crowd, more or less, the same thing I'd been quietly rehearsing to myself for years, without ever finding quite the right audience for it. That I'd once believed the worst year of my life was the one where a marriage ended over a set of laboratory numbers I hadn't chosen and couldn't control. And that I understood now, 5 years and 3 children and 14 employees and one entire rebuilt city block later, that the worst year of my life had actually been the year that finally, mercifully, cracked the container I'd been folding myself smaller and smaller to fit inside, and let something better finally have room to grow. The ordinary Tuesdays were, in the end, the part of this whole story I'd least expected to treasure the most. Caleb coaching Elias's third-grade soccer team with the same flat, tactical seriousness he'd once brought to hand-signaling a tow truck through rush-hour traffic. Diagramming plays on a whiteboard in the garage for a team of 8-year-olds who mostly just wanted to chase the ball in a single excited clump, regardless of position. Josephine's science fair project, an elaborate working model of a rainwater drainage system, built, unmistakably, on principles she'd absorbed from years of watching her father repot seedlings and reframe greenhouse panels, which she presented to a panel of visibly startled judges with a level of technical vocabulary that won her the district prize and, according to her teacher, a slightly alarmed note home suggesting Josephine might benefit from an accelerated engineering program the following year. Wren's insistence, at not quite 5, on having her own small corner of the greenhouse, a raised bed exactly 2 feet square where she grew with fierce and largely successful determination an entirely unnecessary quantity of radishes that nobody in the household particularly wanted to eat, but that everyone dutifully praised at dinner regardless. I found myself, some evenings, simply standing in the kitchen doorway watching the ordinary chaos unfold. Homework spread across the island, Caleb helping Elias sound out a particularly stubborn word, Josephine narrating an elaborate imaginary construction project to Wren, who listened with the rapt, uncritical attention only a much younger sibling can offer. And feeling a kind of gratitude so specific and so total, it occasionally stopped me mid-motion, a dish towel forgotten in my hand, simply absorbing the fact of it. The sheer, improbable good fortune of a life I had once genuinely believed, sitting on a cold apartment floor with $4,000 and a single rosemary plant, might never arrive at all. We still, every October, made the drive back to that first copper kettle booth, a small, private ritual neither of us had ever formally decided on, but that had simply calcified over the years into tradition. Ordering the same apple pie, the same 2-strong coffee, sitting across from each other in the same cracked red vinyl, and talking, sometimes about the kids, sometimes about the Foundation's expansion into a second state, sometimes about nothing at all, simply enjoying the specific pleasure of comfortable silence with someone who had never once, in 8 years, made that silence feel like punishment. It was on one of those October evenings, the kids home with Denise for the night, that Caleb finally asked me the question I'd half expected for years, but that he'd apparently been quietly saving for the right moment. "Do you ever think about it?" he said, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table. "What if I'd been the one to move on to Cherry Street 5 years earlier? Or you'd married someone else first, someone who actually deserved you the first time around?" I considered the question seriously, because he was asking it seriously, no idle small talk in it at all. "I used to," I admitted. "Early on, especially. I'd think about all those years I spent married to Grant, charting temperatures, feeling like I was failing some test nobody had ever properly explained the terms of, and I'd get so angry at the waste of it. But I don't think that anymore." He waited, patient, the way he waited for everything. "I don't think I was ready for you before I went through all of that," I said slowly, working it out loud for maybe the first time. "I don't think I'd have recognized what you were offering if I hadn't first learned, the hard way, exactly what the absence of it felt like. The broken years weren't wasted. They were the drainage. Everything before you was just the roots finally learning where the rot was, so they'd know better the next time." He reached across the table for my hand, his thumb moving slowly over my knuckles the way it had 100 times before. a small, unconscious gesture that still, after 8 years, made something in my chest go warm and quiet. "The best strategic decision I ever made," he said finally, his voice low, "wasn't Sentinel Ridge, and it wasn't the housing initiative, and it definitely wasn't buying up half of Cherry Street on a whim I couldn't entirely explain to my accountant at the time. It was showing up at your fence with a spare pot and no expectation of anything in return. Everything else was just logistics in service of that one decision." I laughed, quiet and genuinely happy, the highest compliment I knew how to offer a man who measured most of his affection in the specific, unglamorous language of things fixed and problems solved. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me," I told him. "And it's disguised, again, as a strategy memo." "Some things never change," he said. And there was that rare, unguarded smile again, the one Duke's runaway sprint had first coaxed out of him years ago, still, after everything, entirely capable of undoing me completely. That evening, after tucking 3 exhausted, park-happy children into bed, story after story after story until even Josephine's negotiating stamina finally gave out, Caleb and I carried our coffee out to the deck of the house outside the city, the one with the greenhouse that never cracked, and settled into the 2 weathered chairs we'd had since our first year together, looking out over the dark shapes of the foothills and, further off, the scattered lights of the city where all of this had started, with a shattered pane of glass and a stranger's steady hands. "Do you ever think about, what if we'd met earlier?" I asked him. The same question I'd asked years before at the diner, but this time from a place of settled peace rather than idle curiosity. The way you might revisit a familiar photograph just to notice, again, how far you'd traveled from the moment it captured. He didn't look away from the darkening ridgeline right away, and I always land on the same answer, he said eventually. No, neither of us was ready. The broken roads brought us here, exactly here. And I wouldn't trade the timing for anything, even the parts that hurt getting through. He turned toward me then, his face lit faintly by the string of lights we'd hung along the deck railing the summer the twins turned 6. "The best decision I ever made wasn't protecting you, or getting even with anyone on your behalf, though I won't pretend some small tactical part of me didn't enjoy watching certain consequences land exactly where they belonged. It was just loving you. Plainly. Without an agenda attached. Everything else, the housing initiative, the foundation, the whole block on Cherry Street, all of it, was just supporting infrastructure built around that one central fact." I leaned my head against his shoulder, the particular comfortable weight of 8 years of evenings just like this one, settling over both of us. "He called you the war reenactor, you know," I said quietly, the first week I knew you. Grant, I mean. "Called you the neighbor who dressed like he was still deployed. Said you were probably desperate for the goodwill of fixing rich people's fences." I felt Caleb's chest move with a silent, low laugh. "The man they all wrote off as the quiet charity case ended up building you a kingdom," I said, finishing the thought the way we sometimes did now, each of us picking up the other sentence without needing the whole thing spoken aloud. "Not a kingdom of money," he corrected gently, his voice a low, warm rumble against the cooling evening air. "A kingdom of actual partnership, of a love that keeps growing instead of shrinking every time life gets complicated, of skinned knees and radish beds and funded housing units and diner pie on Tuesday nights in October." He kissed the top of my head, the same unhurried gesture he'd offered 1,000 times before, and that had somehow never once lost its weight. "And the man everyone assumed was the golden ticket," he added, turned out to be the actual cautionary tale. Life has a strange, patient sense of justice, if you're willing to wait long enough to see it land. We sat like that a long while, watching the last of the light drain out of the sky over the Front Range, the deck string lights taking over the job the sun had finished for the day. The house behind us settled into the specific, particular quiet of a home full of sleeping children who trusted, without ever having to question it, that the ground beneath them would hold. The past, I understood now, sitting there with Caleb's hand loosely wrapped around mine, was a closed book. Its harder lessons fully learned, its debts, such as they'd ever really been, long since settled, without my ever having to lift a hand in vengeance to see them settled fairly. The present was loud and messy and entirely deliberately chosen. 3 children asleep upstairs who would never once know what it felt like to be treated as a disappointing set of statistics. A man beside me who measured love in fixed hinges and reframed windows and quiet, unglamorous acts of showing up over and over, with no expectation of anything in return. And the future, whatever specific shape it eventually took, belonged to us to keep building, one steady foundation at a time, the way Caleb built everything, patiently, without cutting corners, with drainage designed in from the very first layer, so that nothing we grew there would ever again be at risk of rotting quietly from the inside, for want of somewhere for the excess to go. The shattered greenhouse pane all those years ago hadn't just been repaired. It had been entirely reframed, tempered, built to hold up against every winter that came after, strong enough now not merely to survive the cold, but to shelter something living and green and entirely unafraid of the season. The wreckage of one life had become, against every early indication, simply the raw material for a sturdier one. And sitting there in the dark with Caleb's steady heartbeat under my ear, I understood, finally and completely, that the ending I'd once mourned on a cold apartment floor with $4,000 to my name had never actually been an ending at all. It had only ever been the moment the right container, at long last, found me. The journey had been the destination all along, and it turned out to be so much more than I had ever once dared to let myself imagine possible.